Here's one of the first questions I got. This was actually, when I first moved here, this was in the little question box that was out back. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know who asked it, but I've been asked this question a lot, actually. And so I'm sure that other people may have had it. But the question was this: the cremation trend is growing. And the question was, is this an acceptable biblical practice? I think that's an interesting question. I want to say the Bible does not conclusively state a right or a wrong with regards to the means of disposal. Some would argue that when you cremate a body, it's merely hastening the process of dust to dust. If you look at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19, one of the things that we read in the curse is that in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. But others would argue that cremation is without apostolic example in the New Testament. Burying the body, you will find, was the standard practice among the Israelites in the Old Testament and among Christians in the New. There were some exceptions, though. The people decided to cremate Saul and Jonathan, and then later the Israelites came and buried their ashes because their bodies had been mutilated by the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 31. There's another instance where Achan and his family were cremated, but some might argue that was a punishment that they were cremated. They were burned by fire to death. They were executed for sinning against Israel. You read about that in Joshua 7 and verse 25. But these were, again, in a sense, punishments, not standard procedure for most Israelites. Cremation was practiced in biblical times. We sometimes see the burning of bones. We sometimes actually saw Josiah taking some of the bones of some and actually burning them and destroying them in that way. But again, perhaps that was kind of to insult some of the false teachers that were being honored. But in the cultures of the Bible times, burial in a tomb, a cave, or in the ground was the common way to dispose of a human body. There is examples of this in Genesis chapter 23 and verse 19. For example, we'll just kind of quickly just notice a few examples. Genesis chapter 23 and in verse 19. It says in verse 19 that Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah. And so Sarah is buried. Look at Genesis 35 and verse 19. As you continue through there, you find another example of burial from early times. Genesis 35:19, Rachel died. She was buried on the way to Ephrath. Take a look at verse 29 of that same chapter. And Isaac breathed his last. He died. He was gathered to his people. His sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him, probably in the same cave. In 2 Chronicles chapter 16, this is Asa. It speaks of Asa, who was a good king. And 2 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 14 says, they buried him in his own tomb, which he had made for himself in the city of David. They laid him in the bed which was filled with spices, and they made a very great burning for him. And then, of course, we have Jesus, who was buried, again, in a tomb, though. And the same practice continues in the New Testament. John the Baptist is buried after he was beheaded. The disciples come and bury his body to honor his body. The rich man in Luke chapter 16, verse 22 says he was buried. And Lazarus was, again, in the tomb, and he stank after 4 days, as we studied this morning in our Bible class. Ananias and Sapphira, even after they sinned, were buried by the disciples in Acts chapter 5. 6 through 10. So burial was the common practice, but the Bible nowhere commands burial as the only allowed method of disposing of a body. I just want to clear something very simple up, and that is that some people think that cremation interferes with resurrection, and that just isn't true. Cremation does not interfere with God's ability to resurrect the dead, to give us life after death. People have died in countless ways through history. From accidents to warfare, they've been lost at sea, they have been burned in fires, and God still has the power to resurrect them in the future. That doesn't have to be done with a body. Um, and certainly, at some point in time, we all will become dust if we are allowed to decompose long enough. So let's look at one more passage in the New Testament that I think speaks to the fact that God is going to raise us with a new body, and we don't need to be concerned with what our body is like once it is put in the grave or the tomb. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, notice a few verses. Notice verse 25. This is a resurrection chapter. It says that Jesus must reign till he has put all enemies under his feet. 1 Corinthians 15:25. Notice verse 27. When he says all things are put under him, is evident that he who put all things under him is accepted. So this is just more information about Jesus. Notice verse 42. So also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. Clearly, God is going to make a change in our bodies when we are raised. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. God is going to make all things new in the resurrection. And so whether we are cremated or buried doesn't seem to make any difference as to whether or not God has the power to raise our bodies and make them new.